Don't you ever touch my son again. Edward Whitmore's voice cracked through the grand marble hallway so sharply that every servant in the mansion froze where they stood. Naomi Carter stumbled back a half step, her hand pressed against her cheek, her breath caught somewhere deep in her throat as the sting of humiliation burned hotter than pain. The silver tray she had been carrying clattered against the polished floor, crystal glasses spinning in circles before settling into silence. For one endless second, no one moved. No one dared breathe. Edward stood before her in his charcoal suit, chest rising hard, eyes blazing with the kind of fury only grief could create. Behind him, floor-to-ceiling windows framed the gray Connecticut sky, rain streaking down the glass in trembling lines, but inside the Whitmore estate the air felt even colder. Naomi swallowed hard, blinking back tears she refused to let fall. "Sir, I was only trying to calm him," she whispered, her voice trembling but soft. "He was crying. He was scared. You do not touch him unless I say so." Edward snapped, stepping closer, his polished shoes clicking against the stone like hammer blows. "You are staff. Nothing more. Know your place." Naomi lowered her gaze, but her fingers curled tightly at her sides. She had learned long ago that some wounds hurt deeper when people were watching. Just 3 weeks earlier, Naomi Carter had stood outside those same iron gates clutching a single worn suitcase and a folded job offer in shaking hands, wondering how life had brought her there. At 20 years old, with student debt still haunting her, medical bills from her late mother's illness piled in boxes at her tiny apartment, and 2 failed interviews the week before, she hadn't come to the Whitmore estate looking for pride. She had come for survival. The mansion itself looked less like a home and more like a museum built for kings. Towering white columns, fountains glistening beneath imported stone statues, windows taller than most apartments she'd lived in. Even the air inside smelled expensive, like polished wood, fresh lilies, and silence. Naomi had been hired as temporary household staff, assigned mostly to organizing the East Wing, helping in the kitchen, and occasionally assisting with 8-year-old Ethan Whitmore when his tutors or nannies weren't around. At least, that had been the plan. But everyone in the house had warned her about Ethan. "He hasn't spoken right since his mother died," one maid whispered her first day. "Barely lets anyone near him." "He's sweet," another had said quietly. "But broken-hearted children can be hard to reach." Naomi had only nodded, because broken-hearted children were something she understood too well. She had spent years volunteering at grief centers after losing her own younger brother in a car accident when she was 19. She knew the hollow look children got when pain arrived too early. She knew the silence. She knew the fear hidden behind anger. And the very first time she'd seen Ethan, sitting alone under the grand staircase with his knees pulled to his chest and his little hands covering his ears while adults argued in another room, something inside her had cracked wide open. She hadn't meant to interfere. Hadn't meant to cross boundaries. But when his tiny shoulders started shaking and tears slipped silently down his cheeks, instinct had taken over before permission ever entered her mind. She had crouched beside him gently, slowly, careful not to startle him. "Hey there," she'd whispered. "It's okay. You don't have to be scared." And somehow, impossibly, Ethan had looked at her with wide, trembling eyes and reached for her hand. No one had ever told Edward Whitmore that part. No one had told him his son hadn't let another person touch him willingly in almost 2 years. So now, standing in the middle of the foyer with every servant staring and shame heating Naomi's skin, Edward only saw what his grief allowed him to see. A stranger too close to the only thing he had left in the world. But before another word could leave his mouth, the sharp sound of small footsteps thundered from the staircase above, and every head in the room turned as Ethan Whitmore appeared at the top landing, pale-faced, wide-eyed, trembling so violently he could barely stand. Ethan Whitmore stood frozen at the top of the staircase, his small hands gripping the white banister so tightly his knuckles had gone pale. And for a moment the entire mansion seemed to stop breathing with him. His chest rose and fell in sharp, uneven bursts, his lower lip trembling as his wide blue eyes locked not on his father, but on Naomi. She saw the panic there instantly. The fear. The desperation. The kind that lived deep inside a child who had learned too early that love could disappear overnight. "Ethan," Edward said, his voice softening immediately as he stepped forward, all his anger shifting into concern. "Buddy, it is okay. Come here." But Ethan did not move toward him. He only stared at Naomi, his breathing growing faster, tears already forming in his eyes. Then suddenly the boy bolted down the stairs, nearly tripping over his own feet in his rush, and before anyone could react, he threw himself into Naomi's arms with such force she nearly lost balance. The room went still. Naomi instinctively caught him, wrapping both arms around his trembling little frame as Ethan buried his face against her stomach, clutching the fabric of her uniform with desperate fingers. "Do not make her leave," he sobbed, his voice cracking so hard it barely sounded human. "Please do not make her leave too." The words hit the room like shattered glass. Edward froze mid-step. His face drained of color so quickly Naomi thought he might collapse right there onto the marble floor. Ethan was crying now in full, shaking so hard his entire body trembled against Naomi's arms. "Everybody leaves," the boy whimpered. "Mommy left and Grandma left and Nanny Kate left, and everybody always leaves and I do not want her to go too." Naomi's heart broke so suddenly it felt physical, like something inside her chest had split clean in two. Her eyes flooded instantly, but she blinked the tears away and sank slowly to her knees so she could hold Ethan properly, brushing a gentle hand through his soft blonde hair while his cries soaked into her shoulder. "I am right here, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice so tender even the older house staff turned away to hide their emotions. "I am right here. Breathe with me, okay? Nice and slow. You are okay." Ethan obeyed her almost instinctively, trying through hiccuping sobs to match her breathing. In for 4. Out for 4. Again. Again. Naomi kept one hand on his back, rubbing slow circles between his shoulders the way her mother used to do when storms scared her as a child. Slowly, miraculously, Ethan's sobs began to soften. His tiny body relaxed by degrees until his trembling eased and his breathing steadied. Edward stood 10 feet away, staring in stunned disbelief, unable to move, unable to speak. He had spent nearly 2 years paying the best child psychologists in New York, the finest therapists in Boston, specialists from as far as Chicago, and not one of them had managed to calm Ethan during an episode the way Naomi just had in under 60 seconds. Not one. "How did you?" Edward's voice came out hoarse, almost inaudible. Naomi looked up carefully, still kneeling with Ethan curled against her. "I told you, sir," she said quietly. "He was scared." Edward opened his mouth, but no words came. For the first time since his wife's funeral, his polished confidence, his control, his cold perfection all seemed to vanish at once, leaving behind only a father who suddenly realized he might not understand his own son nearly as well as he thought. Ethan sniffled and tightened his grip around Naomi again before whispering in a tiny broken voice that barely reached above a breath. "She sings like Mommy used to." Edward's entire body stiffened. Naomi blinked, stunned. Ethan slowly tilted his head up, tears still wet on his cheeks, and looked directly at his father before saying the words that turned the air in the mansion ice cold. "She was there that night, the night Mommy did not come home." The words hit Edward like freezing water poured straight into his chest. Every sound in the room vanished. Even the rain tapping softly against the tall windows seemed to disappear beneath the weight of what his son had just said. Edward stared at Ethan, his entire body rigid, his jaw tightening so hard the muscles trembled beneath his skin. "What did you say?" he asked, but his voice no longer carried authority. It sounded thin. Fragile. Ethan sniffled against Naomi's shoulder, suddenly looking nervous, as though he had not meant to speak out loud. Naomi herself sat frozen on the marble floor, one arm wrapped protectively around him, her heartbeat pounding so violently she could hear it ringing in her ears. Edward stepped closer, slower this time, crouching down until he was eye level with his son. "Ethan," he said carefully, each word deliberate. "What do you mean she was there that night?" The boy looked between them, his little face pale and wet with tears, and swallowed hard before whispering. At the hospital. Edward blinked once, confusion flashing across his face. Naomi's entire body went stiff beneath Ethan's weight. Her breath stopped cold in her lungs. No. No, no, no. She knew exactly what he was about to say before the words even left his mouth. When Mommy was sick, Ethan continued softly, his voice trembling. She was the nice lady who sang to me when Daddy was in the room crying. Edward's eyes snapped toward Naomi so sharply it was as if the whole world had tilted under him. Naomi felt heat rush to her face. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Edward stared at her with dawning disbelief, his brows furrowing as pieces of memory long buried beneath grief suddenly began clawing their way back to the surface. The hospital. St. Catherine's Memorial. Winter 2 years ago. Endless nights beneath fluorescent lights and white ceilings. The smell of antiseptic. The hum of machines. His wife, Charlotte, fading slowly in bed while the world around him collapsed inch by inch. And there had been someone. A young nurse assistant. Quiet. Kind. Gentle with Ethan when his panic attacks got bad in the waiting room. Someone who always hummed soft lullabies when his son cried. Someone who sat beside Ethan during the night Charlotte's condition worsened because Edward himself had been too broken to move. "Oh my God!" Edward breathed, his face draining of all color. Naomi looked down, unable to meet his eyes anymore. "I did not know he remembered me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The room stood in stunned silence. Edward slowly rose to his feet, still staring at her, as though seeing her for the first time. "You worked at St. Catherine's?" he asked. Naomi nodded faintly. "Part-time while I was finishing school. I was in pediatric support care." Edward's throat tightened visibly. "You were there, with Ethan?" Naomi nodded again. "Charlotte used to ask me to stay with him whenever things got bad. She hated when he saw her in pain. She wanted him distracted. Safe. Calm." Edward staggered back half a step as if the air had been knocked from his lungs. Memories flooded him all at once now, brutal and relentless. Charlotte smiling weakly from her hospital bed. Charlotte whispering to him, "There is a sweet young woman down the hall helping Ethan. He likes her voice." Charlotte saying, "She makes him feel safe." At the time he had barely noticed. Barely looked. His entire soul had been consumed by fear, by grief, by helplessness. But Ethan had noticed. Ethan had remembered. Naomi lowered her eyes, her voice trembling now. "After your wife passed, I left the hospital a few months later. My mother got sick. I had to take whatever work I could find after that. I never imagined." Her words faltered. Edward stood speechless, shame spreading across his face so visibly even the house staff shifted awkwardly where they stood. He had humiliated the one person his dying wife had trusted near their son. The one person Ethan remembered when everything else in his world had fallen apart. Ethan tugged softly on Naomi's sleeve and whispered in a small voice, "Mommy said angels sing soft when people are scared." Naomi's eyes filled instantly. Then Ethan looked up at his father, innocent and trembling, and said quietly, "That is why I knew her voice." Edward Whitmore stood motionless in the center of the foyer, staring at Naomi as though the ground beneath him had disappeared, while Ethan remained curled against her side with his little fingers still gripping her sleeve like letting go might make her vanish. No one in the room dared speak. The house staff had quietly drifted away one by one, sensing the moment had become too personal, too raw, leaving only the three of them beneath the pale chandelier light and the soft gray shadows cast by the storm outside. Edward swallowed hard, but even that small motion looked difficult for him now. His pride, his anger, his certainty had all drained from his face, leaving behind only something Naomi had not seen in him before: regret. Deep, crushing regret. "Everyone leave us," he said finally, his voice low and uneven. The last of the servants disappeared instantly, and silence settled over the mansion like fresh snow. Edward looked down at his son and knelt slowly in front of him, his expensive suit wrinkling against the polished marble floor without him seeming to notice. "Ethan," he said gently, his voice softer than Naomi had ever heard it. Why did you never tell me you remembered her? Ethan sniffled and wiped his nose with the back of his sleeve, still leaning into Naomi's side. Because every time I talked about Mommy you cried, he whispered. The words struck Edward so hard his breath visibly caught. Naomi watched the pain spread across his face like a crack through glass. Ethan looked down at the floor and continued in a trembling voice only a child could make sound so honest. I did not want to make you sad more. Edward's eyes flooded instantly. He bowed his head for a moment, his shoulders tightening as if holding himself together took all his strength. Naomi turned away slightly, giving him dignity in the middle of his grief, but when he lifted his face again his eyes were wet and shining. Buddy, he whispered hoarsely, you never make me sad talking about Mommy. Never. Ethan stared at him uncertainly. Edward reached out slowly, brushing his son's hair back from his forehead with trembling fingers. I should have told you that, he said. I should have told you a long time ago. Then he stood, slowly turning toward Naomi. She rose to her feet instinctively, her heart pounding so loudly she thought he must hear it. For several seconds Edward simply stared at her, and in that stare Naomi saw 1,000 unspoken things moving behind his eyes. Shame. Memory. Realization. Grief. Finally he spoke, his voice rough and stripped bare of the arrogance he once wore so easily. Miss Carter. He stopped, swallowed, then started again. Naomi. I owe you more than an apology. Naomi shifted awkwardly, still unsure what to do with her hands, her cheeks burning from embarrassment and emotion. Sir, you do not have to, yes, Edward interrupted softly. I do. His eyes lowered briefly, unable to fully meet hers. I judged you before I knew the truth. I let my fear for my son blind me to the fact that you have done more for him in 3 weeks than anyone has managed in 2 years. Naomi's throat tightened. She had expected anger from him. Distance. Coldness. She had not expected this. Edward exhaled slowly and rubbed a hand across his jaw, his composure visibly struggling to return. Charlotte trusted very few people near Ethan near the end, he said quietly. If she trusted you. His voice faltered before he forced it steady. Then I should have too. Naomi felt tears sting her eyes again, but she blinked them back quickly. I never meant to overstep, Mr. Whitmore, she said softly. I only wanted to help him because I remembered how scared he was back then. Edward nodded once, his expression unreadable for a moment before softening. And somehow, he said almost to himself, you still remembered him too. Ethan suddenly tugged Naomi's hand, looking up at both adults with wide, hopeful eyes. Can she stay? He asked. The innocence in his voice shattered what little emotional distance remained. Edward looked at his son, then back at Naomi, and for the first time since she had entered his home, his voice carried no command when he spoke. Only sincerity. That, he said quietly, is entirely up to her. Naomi looked down at Ethan's pleading face, his small hand warm in hers, then back at Edward standing there broken open in ways grief had never allowed before. But before she could answer, a sharp voice suddenly echoed from the upstairs landing. Edward, what exactly is she still doing in this house? All three turned at once toward the staircase, and Naomi's blood ran cold when she saw the elegant older woman standing there with a diamond cane in one hand and judgment blazing in her eyes. Edward's mother had arrived. Naomi felt every muscle in her body tighten as Margaret Whitmore descended the staircase one deliberate step at a time, her silver heels clicking sharply against the wood, each sound slicing through the silence like judgment, made physical. Even at 71, Margaret carried herself like royalty carved from ice, her tailored cream suit flawless, her pearl necklace resting against her throat like armor, and her sharp gray eyes landed on Naomi with the kind of cold recognition that did not bother pretending to be polite. Well? Margaret said, stopping at the bottom of the stairs and looking from Edward to Naomi, and finally to Ethan clinging tightly to Naomi's hand. I asked a question? Edward straightened immediately, his entire posture shifting as if instinct alone had made him stand taller. Mother, now is not the time. Clearly it is exactly the time, Margaret replied, her voice smooth but cutting. Because the last time I checked, household employees do not stand in the center of the foyer holding my grandson while my son looks at them like they belong here. Naomi lowered her eyes instantly, her stomach twisting into knots. She knew that tone. She had heard versions of it her entire life. The kind of voice that could smile while making someone feel 2 inches tall. Ethan moved closer to Naomi, half hiding behind her leg. Margaret noticed immediately, and her lips thinned. Ethan, sweetheart, come to grandmother. But Ethan did not move. He only gripped Naomi tighter. Margaret's expression darkened. Ethan. No, Ethan whispered. The room went still again. Margaret blinked, clearly stunned by the defiance. Edward stepped forward carefully. Mother, enough. Ethan has had a difficult afternoon. And I can see exactly why. Margaret snapped, eyes flashing toward Naomi. This is what happens when boundaries are forgotten. Staff begins thinking they are family. Children become confused. Emotional attachments form where they do not belong. Naomi's cheeks burned hot, humiliation flooding her so hard she thought she might be sick. Edward's jaw tightened. She has done nothing wrong. Margaret let out a short laugh so dry it barely sounded human. Edward, please. I know grief has clouded your judgment these last 2 years, but do not be ridiculous. You cannot possibly be considering keeping her after this display. I am considering what is best for my son, Edward said firmly. Margaret's eyes narrowed. Your son needs discipline, structure, professional care. Not. Her gaze slid slowly over Naomi from head to toe, lingering just long enough to make the insult clear before she finished. Sentimental charity. Naomi's breath caught. The words hit like a slap sharper than any hand ever could. She swallowed hard and stared at the floor, fighting the sting behind her eyes, but Ethan suddenly stepped forward in front of her, his little body trembling yet brave. Do not talk to her like that, he said, his voice shaking but loud enough to echo. Margaret stared down at him in disbelief. Excuse me? Ethan's tiny fists clenched at his sides. She is nice to me. She sings to me when I cry. She stayed when everybody else leaves. His lip trembled, but he forced the words out anyway. You are mean. Margaret's face turned pale with shock. Edward's eyes widened. Naomi dropped to one knee instantly beside Ethan, gently touching his shoulder. Sweetheart, it is okay, she whispered, but Ethan only shook his head, tears welling in his eyes again. Margaret stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing as if language itself had failed her. Edward looked from his son to Naomi to his mother, and something inside him seemed to harden all at once. He stepped forward and placed himself between Naomi and Margaret completely. That is enough, he said, his voice low and final. Margaret stared at him. Edward, no. His tone cut through the room like steel. For 2 years I have let everyone tell me what Ethan needs. Therapists. Doctors. You. And for 2 years none of us have reached him the way she has. Margaret's eyes flashed with anger. You cannot be serious. I am more serious than I have been in a very long time. Edward turned toward Naomi then, his voice gentler but no less certain. Naomi Carter is staying. Margaret looked utterly stunned, but before she could speak again, Naomi stepped back, her eyes glistening, and quietly shook her head. No, Mr. Whitmore, she whispered. Everyone turned toward her. Her voice trembled, but she forced the words out. I think it would be better if I leave. Ethan's face collapsed instantly in horror. No, he cried, clutching her hand. But Naomi looked at Edward with tears gathering in her eyes and whispered the words that shattered the fragile peace all over again. Because if I stay, your family will never truly accept me. The words left Naomi's mouth so softly they almost disappeared into the silence, but somehow they struck harder than anything else said that day. Ethan's little fingers tightened around her hand with desperate force, panic flooding his face so quickly his breathing turned shallow again. No, he whimpered, shaking his head over and over. No, please do not go. Please. Naomi dropped to her knees in front of him, her own tears finally slipping free as she cupped his small face gently in her hands. Sweetheart, she whispered, her voice trembling. Sometimes loving someone means knowing when you're being here makes things harder for them. Ethan shook his head harder, tears streaming now. You do not make it harder. You make it better. The innocence in his voice broke something in every person standing there. Even Margaret's rigid expression faltered for half a second, though pride quickly hardened it again. Naomi swallowed against the ache in her throat and stood slowly, brushing tears from her cheeks before they could fully fall. Mr. Whitmore, she said quietly, refusing to look directly at Margaret. Thank you for the opportunity. Truly. But I think it is best if I collect my things and leave tonight. Edward stared at her in disbelief, his brow furrowing deeply. Naomi, no. Please, she whispered. Do not make this harder than it already is. Then she turned and began walking toward the servants' corridor before anyone could stop her. Ethan cried out behind her instantly. Naomi! But she kept moving because if she stopped now, she knew she would never have the strength to leave. Her vision blurred with tears as she hurried down the long hallway toward the staff quarters, her chest aching so badly she could barely breathe. Behind her she could hear Ethan sobbing somewhere in the distance, could hear Edward calling his name, could hear Margaret's clipped voice, trying to calm the situation, but Naomi did not turn around. She made it to her tiny room at the end of the east wing and shut the door behind her, leaning against it as tears finally poured down her face. The room suddenly felt impossibly small. Her suitcase sat half unpacked in the corner, the little lamp by her bed casting warm yellow light over the cheap comforter she had folded neatly that morning, never imagining she would be packing it all away by nightfall. Her hands shook violently as she pulled open drawers and began stuffing clothes into her bag with trembling fingers, tears dripping onto the fabric. Why does it always end like this? She whispered brokenly to no one. She had worked so hard to survive. To stay kind. To stay soft in a world that kept trying to harden her. And yet somehow every place that ever felt close to becoming home always slipped through her fingers before she could keep it. Downstairs, the mansion had descended into chaos. Ethan was crying uncontrollably now, thrashing in Edward's arms, his tiny voice hoarse from screaming Naomi's name over and over. I want her! I want Naomi! Please bring her back! Edward's face had gone pale with panic as he tried everything to calm him, but nothing worked. Margaret stood nearby, shaken and speechless now as the consequences of her words unfolded before her eyes in brutal clarity. Do something! Edward snapped at her, his own voice breaking. This is what you wanted, is not it? Margaret looked horrified. Edward, I did not mean for this. You never mean it, he shouted. But this is always what happens. Then suddenly Ethan ripped free from his father's arms and sprinted toward the staircase, tears blinding his eyes. I will make her stay, he screamed. I will tell her she has to stay. But in his panic his small foot slipped on the polished floor. Time seemed to stop. Edward lunged forward with a shout as Ethan's tiny body pitched dangerously toward the edge of the first stair, and Margaret gasped so sharply it sounded like her heart had stopped. Then before anyone else could move, a blur rushed from the hallway. Naomi. She dropped her suitcase and flew forward without hesitation, reaching Ethan just in time to catch him before he fell. The force of his momentum knocked them both to the floor, but Naomi wrapped around him protectively, holding him close as Ethan burst into fresh sobs against her chest. The entire mansion froze. Edward stood motionless, staring at the woman who had just thrown herself forward without 1 second of hesitation to protect his son. Naomi clutched Ethan tightly, tears falling into his hair as she whispered over and over. I have got you. I have got you, baby. You are okay. You are safe. And when Edward looked at her kneeling there on the floor, holding his son like her own life mattered less than his, something deep inside him shifted forever. The entire mansion stood in stunned silence as Naomi remained on the polished floor with Ethan trembling in her arms, his little hands gripping her shirt so tightly his knuckles had turned white, while her own breathing came in uneven gasps from the rush of fear that still pounded through her chest. Edward stared at them as though the world around him had faded away, every sound, every person, every ounce of pride stripped from his awareness until only one truth remained before him. When danger came, Naomi had not hesitated for even half a second. She had moved before anyone else. She had chosen Ethan before herself. Slowly, Edward dropped to his knees in front of them, his expensive clothes wrinkling against the floor as tears glistened in his eyes for the second time that day. "Ethan," he whispered shakily, brushing trembling fingers through his son's hair. "Are you hurt?" Ethan shook his head against Naomi's chest but did not let go of her. He only buried his face deeper into her shoulder and cried softly. "I thought she was leaving forever." Edward's face twisted in visible pain. Naomi gently rubbed Ethan's back, still trying to steady her own heartbeat as she whispered comfort into his ear. "I am right here, sweetheart. I am right here." Edward stared at her for several long seconds, his throat moving as if he were struggling to swallow emotions too large for words. Then, to Naomi's shock, he lowered his head. "I was wrong," he said quietly. The room seemed to freeze around the confession. Margaret looked stunned. Naomi blinked in disbelief. Edward raised his eyes to meet hers, and there was no pride left in them now, no distance, no coldness, only honesty stripped bare and aching. "I was wrong about you from the moment you walked into this house," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I judged you before I knew your heart. I let my fear, my grief, and my own arrogance blind me to what was standing right in front of me." Naomi's lips parted slightly, but no words came. Edward glanced down at Ethan still clinging to her, then back up again. "You care about him in a way that cannot be taught. In a way money cannot buy. In a way no title or degree can manufacture." His voice cracked, and he had to stop for a moment before continuing. "And when he needed someone most, he chose you." Naomi felt tears filling her eyes all over again. Edward stood slowly and then did something no one in the Whitmore house had likely ever seen before. He turned toward his mother. "You owe her an apology." Margaret's head snapped toward him. "Edward, no." His voice was calm now, but firmer than steel. "Not another word. You judged her without knowing her, and because of that my son nearly got hurt trying to keep the only person who has made him feel safe from leaving this house." Margaret's lips trembled faintly. For the first time since arriving, her confidence seemed shaken. She looked toward Naomi, then toward Ethan still wrapped around her, and something in the older woman's face softened with reluctant shame. After a long silence, Margaret stepped forward slowly. "Miss Carter." Her voice had lost all sharpness. "I spoke cruelly, and I allowed my assumptions to speak louder than my compassion. For that, I am sorry." Naomi blinked in stunned silence. Margaret Whitmore did not seem like the kind of woman who apologized to anyone. Edward turned back toward Naomi then, his eyes softer than she had ever seen them. "Please stay," he said quietly. "Not because Ethan wants it. Not because I need help. But because this house is better with you in it." Naomi's breath caught. The words hung between them like something sacred. Ethan slowly lifted his tear-streaked face and looked up at Naomi with trembling hope in his eyes. "Please?" he whispered. Naomi stared at him, then at Edward, then around the mansion that hours ago had felt cold and impossible and foreign. But now, somehow, beneath the golden lights and the quiet rain beyond the windows, it no longer felt like a place she merely worked. It felt like something warmer. Something dangerous in its softness. Like belonging. Naomi smiled through tears and gently nodded. "Okay," she whispered. Ethan let out a cry of joy and threw his arms around her neck again. Edward laughed through tears himself, a broken sound full of relief and gratitude. But as Naomi stood there holding Ethan while Edward watched them both with something new in his eyes, something deeper than gratitude, Margaret quietly observed the way her son looked at Naomi, and suddenly she realized this was no longer only about Ethan anymore. The rain had stopped by morning, and sunlight poured through the towering windows of the Whitmore estate in long golden beams that made the marble floors glow like polished honey, But for Naomi, the entire house felt different now, softer somehow, warmer in ways she had not thought possible just 24 hours earlier. Ethan had not let go of her hand all through breakfast, proudly insisting she sit beside him while he ate pancakes and strawberries, smiling more in one morning than Naomi had seen in 3 weeks combined. Even the kitchen staff whispered among themselves about how different the boy looked, how the shadows under his eyes seemed lighter, how laughter had finally returned to rooms long buried in silence. But the biggest difference was Edward. Naomi noticed it in the way his eyes followed her whenever she moved through the room, in the way his voice softened whenever he addressed her, in the way his posture changed entirely whenever she and Ethan laughed together, as though watching them healed some private wound inside him. By noon the house had fallen into peaceful quiet, Ethan upstairs for his tutoring lessons while Naomi folded laundry in the sunlit family room, the scent of fresh linen and lavender filling the air around her. She did not hear Edward enter at first, but when she turned and saw him standing in the doorway, her breath caught slightly. He had loosened his tie, rolled his sleeves to his forearms, and for once looked less like a millionaire and more like simply a man, tired and thoughtful and strangely vulnerable. "You have been avoiding me all morning," Naomi said softly, trying to lighten the sudden tension in the air. Edward gave a faint smile. "Maybe I have been trying to find the right words." Naomi set the folded towel aside slowly. "For what?" He stepped closer, hands resting in his pockets, his eyes thoughtful. "For something I should have said long before now." Naomi's heartbeat quickened. Edward exhaled deeply before speaking, his voice low and steady. "When Charlotte was alive, she used to tell me that the strongest people in this world are never the loudest, never the richest, never the ones who demand attention." His eyes lifted to hers, warm and unguarded. "She used to say strength looks like kindness when kindness is hardest to give." Naomi swallowed hard, emotion already tightening her chest. Edward stepped closer still. "And I think, if she had met you properly, she would have loved you." Naomi's eyes instantly filled with tears. Edward's own expression softened further, his voice dropping almost to a whisper. "You walked into this house carrying your own pain, your own burdens, and instead of protecting yourself, you gave your heart to a broken little boy who was not even yours to love." Naomi's breath trembled. "Edward! No, let me finish." His voice was gentle, but certain. "I spent 2 years believing I had to control everything to protect my son. But all he ever needed was not control. He needed comfort. He needed patience. He needed someone who could love him through his grief instead of trying to manage it." He paused, eyes glistening faintly now. "He needed you." Naomi could barely breathe under the weight of his words. Then Edward gave a small, almost embarrassed smile. "And if I am honest..." He stepped closer one final time, until only inches separated them. "I think somewhere along the way, I started needing you too." Naomi's entire body froze. The room went still around them. Even the distant ticking of the grandfather clock seemed to vanish beneath the pounding in her ears. Edward looked at her with an expression so open, so sincere, it made her heart ache. "I know this is sudden," he whispered. "And I know I do not deserve to ask for anything after how I treated you in the beginning. But Naomi," his voice dropped lower, "I have not felt alive in a very long time until you walked into this house." Naomi stared at him, tears slipping silently down her cheeks now, her heart racing so wildly she thought it might burst. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could say a single word, a tiny voice called excitedly from the hallway upstairs. "Daddy!" Both turned instantly as Ethan came running down the hall with a wide grin and a piece of paper in his hand. "Look what I drew!" Edward stepped back quickly, the moment broken but still hanging heavy in the air between them. Ethan ran straight to them and proudly held up his drawing with both hands. Naomi smiled at first, but the moment her eyes landed on the page, her breath caught. It was a picture of 3 people standing together beneath a bright yellow sun. 1 tall man. 1 woman with dark skin. 1 little blond boy between them. And written in crooked child handwriting above their heads were the words that made both adults freeze completely: "My family." Naomi stared at the drawing in Ethan's small hands as if the world had narrowed to that single sheet of paper. Her breath caught somewhere between her chest and throat, while beside her Edward stood equally frozen, his expression unreadable beneath the warm afternoon light pouring through the windows. Ethan beamed proudly, completely unaware of the emotional storm his simple drawing had created, and pointed eagerly to each figure with his tiny finger. "That is Daddy," he said brightly. "That is me." Then he pointed to the woman beside them, smiling even wider. "And that is Naomi, because families stay together." The innocence of it hit Naomi so hard tears filled her eyes instantly. Edward turned his face slightly, swallowing hard as emotion visibly tightened his jaw. Naomi slowly knelt in front of Ethan, her voice trembling when she finally managed to speak. "Sweetheart, this is beautiful." Ethan grinned. "Miss Parker said we had to draw what home feels like." Naomi's heart nearly shattered. Edward looked down sharply. "And this is what you drew?" Ethan nodded like the answer was obvious. "Because home feels happy now." Silence swallowed the room whole. Naomi looked up at Edward, and the raw emotion in his eyes mirrored her own so deeply it almost stole her breath. Ethan hugged the drawing against his chest proudly before running off toward the kitchen to show one of the maids, leaving the two adults standing alone in the sudden quiet. For a long moment neither of them spoke. Then Edward looked at the hallway where his son had disappeared and whispered, almost to himself, "He has not called this place home in 2 years." Naomi wiped gently beneath her eyes, trying to steady her breathing. Edward turned to face her fully now, his gaze intense and warm and more vulnerable than ever before. "Naomi," he said softly, stepping closer, "I know life does not give second chances often. I know timing is messy and grief changes people, and nothing about this is simple." His voice trembled faintly. "But I have spent too long pushing away the people who matter because I was afraid to lose them." Naomi's chest tightened. Edward took another step forward until they stood inches apart. "I do not want to make that mistake again." Her breath shook. "Edward, you gave my son his smile back," he whispered. "You gave this house warmth again. You reminded me what it feels like to wake up and not dread the day ahead." Tears slipped freely down Naomi's cheeks now. Edward reached up slowly, carefully brushing one away with the gentlest touch. "You did not just save Ethan," he whispered. "You saved me too." Naomi broke then, emotion flooding through her all at once, and without thinking she stepped forward into him. Edward caught her instantly, wrapping his arms around her as she cried softly against his chest, years of loneliness and fear and exhaustion pouring out in trembling breaths. He held her like something precious, something sacred, his cheek resting gently against her hair. Across the hall, unnoticed by either of them, Margaret stood quietly near the doorway, watching with tears glistening faintly in her eyes as realization settled deep into her heart. She had spent her whole life believing status built families, that blood and wealth and reputation made a home. But standing there now, watching her son hold the woman who had healed them both, Margaret understood at last that love did not arrive dressed in pedigree or approval. Sometimes it arrived wearing a servant's uniform and carrying more grace than anyone in the room deserved. Weeks later the Whitmore mansion no longer felt cold. Laughter echoed through the halls. Ethan's nightmares faded. The staff smiled more. Flowers appeared fresh in every room because Naomi insisted homes should smell alive. And one golden Sunday afternoon, as sunlight spilled across the back garden in warm amber waves, Edward stood beside Naomi while Ethan ran through the grass chasing bubbles, his laughter bright against the wind.